Hello there, my name is Rosie Goldsmith and I'm thrilled to welcome you to Rock Talks, our new conversation series featuring literary rock stars from Romania and Britain. Tonight's live conversation with Andrei Codrescu and David Mitchell launches our new literature festival, Romania Rocks, brought to you by the Romanian Cultural Institute in London and the European Literature Network. The literature of Romania really does rock, and if you aren't already familiar with it, over the next 4 weeks we'll be introducing you to some of Romania's greatest living writers when they meet to discuss life and literature with their equally brilliant British counterparts. Elif Shafak, Ben Okri, Ian Rankin, they'll all be joining us. All our events are free, they're easy to access, all the books we discuss will be available to purchase, and all details about everything are on our websites. Now, feel free at the end to ask any questions as well. You'll need to email your questions to the address that you'll see imminently on the screen, or you can make any comments also on social media. Now, I'm your host, and a warning, I'm totally biased. I'm an inveterate and irrepressible lover of great writing from around the world, and I'm inclined to get over-enthusiastic. But justifiably, and wouldn't you too, if you had both David Mitchell and Andrei Codrescu in your living room. Welcome to you both to my virtual sitting room. Where are you in real life? Andrei, where are you?
I'm doing time in Brooklyn, New York.
And which room? You're obviously in your office or in a room at least with lots of rather precariously balanced books.
Right, this is where they keep me and the books, that is. And Brooklyn is also a place with a lot of cells for writers because there are writers everywhere in there.
You have to be locked up, do you?
Somebody made me just close the door.
Right. Well, you're locked in for the next hour anyway. It's great to have you here, Andrei. And David, we can't read anything from your backdrop. Is that deliberate? There's not. It's just
yes,
so.
Yeah, it's my international man of mystery, Zen effect that I'm after. But since you've now embarrassed me slightly, I will just show you that this is the back bedroom, and through that window is West Cork in Ireland. It's a drizzly evening. The autumn is moving in, the nights are getting shorter, and this is home. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we're all at home. I'm at home as well in Wiltshire, and although sporting my Romanian blouse just for the impact of the day. Now, David, you've been virtually touring with your latest novel, with Utopia Avenue, which both Andrei and I have read. A lot of magic carpet traveling over the past few months. And where have you been? I mean, have you actually been to Romania in that time, or will you? Is today your first virtual trip to Romania?
This is indeed my first virtual trip to Romania. I've not yet had the pleasure of travelling to Andrei's homeland, but I hope to one day. I'm published in Romanian, which is an extra reason to go, and I would like to learn more about the culture and the literature and the poetry. So I'm looking forward to have the chance to do that this evening.
Well, it's great, isn't it, that at least we can start you off here. I know they'd love to have you in Romania. So let's start off, because one of the reasons I wanted to bring specifically the two of you together, because I was reading Utopia Avenue, and I've read all of David's novels and had the pleasure of interviewing him about nearly all of them too over the last few years. But this one particularly struck me as being the right one to talk to Andrei about, because it's set in 1966-67. And when I was reading your biography, Andrei, I saw that you actually left Romania in 1966. Yeah. So for you, it was a traumatic, difficult year. You left your country, left a Stalinist country, and went to live in the United States.
It was traumatic. It was also a terribly exciting time to be 19 years old and be in New York. There was a revolution going on. Riots, the American cities are on fire, poets were everywhere. Allen Ginsberg was just another guy in the neighborhood. The music, however, that in David's book is, I think, later. I mean, that scene of Allen Ginsberg showing up. Allen had friends in London, and he visited them quite a bit. But the music itself, I think, is of another vintage because I'm not so familiar with it. I have friends who were educating me and who've read Utopia Avenue, and they recognized other things, and I wasn't familiar with them by then. I met Alan in 1967. I went to his place on the Lower East Side on 12th Street, and I asked these guys who were sitting on the steps if they knew where Allen Ginsberg was. And they had a little conference, and they really had no idea. So I walked into the building, and there were a few mailboxes, and one of them said Ginsberg Orlovsky. So I walked up the 3 flights of stairs and knocked on the door, and a perfectly naked Peter Orlovsky opened the door, and he didn't say anything, and I followed him to the bathroom where he was spending all his time in the bathtub because for a reason or another, and Alan wasn't there. So I was about to leave when Alan came in, and he was very affable and generous, and he gave me books to read.
Yeah.
We spoke in very bad French because I didn't speak English.
So you arrived in the States because first of all you went to Detroit, didn't you? And then you went to New York after that, quite quickly after that, I think. And you didn't speak any English at all, is that right?
Detroit was one of the cities on fire because we were driving on the John Lodge Expressway, and Jose Feliciano was on the radio singing, "Come on, baby, light my fire." And I turned around, and there was Detroit in flames. And I thought, what a welcome. It was wonderful.
That is too perfectly 1968. That is too perfectly 60s.
You can see why I needed to bring you together. So we've got this perfect, as I saw it in my clever brain, hopefully, this perfect marriage of the two of you, at least starting in the 60s. I thought it would be a good kind of launch pad. But David, the book, just in case others don't know it, it is about a band, and it starts in Soho, 1967, and you've created this completely new band, every single detail of their lives and where they live, their songs, their lyrics. It is as though it were a real band. It's absolutely brilliant. It's 2 years in their lives. It's wonderful, and Andrei's read it as well. Why did you set it in that era? What was it about that era for you? I mean, Andrei obviously loved arriving in the States at that time, but what was it about that time for you?
Happily, Andrei has kind of answered that question for me already. Revolution was in the air, artistically, politically, socially, in so many ways. Ideas got kicked up for the first time. They were seen as utopian, and pretty soon their application in the real world crashed. But from that wreckage, emerged attitudes and institutions that became foundational to the world that I grew up in. Notions that LGBTQ issues and people were not unspeakable deviants, but human beings like everybody else, and that prejudice towards them was not acceptable but an abhorrence. Things like drug rehabilitation programs can trace their roots back to the 60s, or legal rights for immigrants can trace their roots back to the 60s. Even the beginnings of neurodiversity. My son's autistic, I should say. Andrei said this is a world I have one foot in, so to speak. But ideas that autistic people should be respected and welcomed into society rather than locked up forever can trace their roots back to the 60s. Civil rights, racism, of course, these issues erupted at the end of the 60s, and as Andrei said, American cities were on fire because of them. Yet, of course, these are very, very contemporary issues as well. And so what I want to say is that in this period, utopia became, or a more utopian society, a fairer society, the kind of country that I want to live in, the kind of society that I want to be a member of. It was glimpsed by many people at the same time, maybe by a critical mass of people. Now, the window, these glimpses were only live visible for a year, 18 months, but as long as you have glimpses, then you can set a course to a future worth traveling to. So many of the reasons that I am glad to be alive now, and many of the reasons that we have much better lives than our great grandparents or great great grandparents, or at least more equitable lives, exist because of what a critical mass of people were marching in the street about in the late 60s. It's a very long and not particularly coherent answer to your question, Rosie, but
no, it's
the era it chose itself. As for the politics, so for the arts. And in music, just things happen for the first time. The idea that an album wasn't a container of songs, but a form of narrative happened for the first time. The idea that influences from other musical cultures could be incorporated, could be respected, and just I suppose the idea of the mashup. There's just the experimentalism in music at the time, not just rock music, but jazz and classical music as well. Just an explosion, an eruption of innovation. It was irresistible. It was an irresistible era to choose. I wouldn't have chosen any other. Over.
And if we have time afterwards, we'll have a couple of short readings from both Andrei and David from their latest books as well. But Andrei, what a period to arrive in the United States then from Romania in those years. I mean, did you look back?
To continue,
you were about 20, weren't you, at the time? You said 1920.
Right. To continue on of these ideas of David, used very interesting word, the wreckage, because it was indeed an explosion, and that wreckage moved us forward in time at a great speed in very good ways in many ways. At the same time, you had a kind of other things that came out of the wreckage, including Donald Trump, who was part of the there was a right-wing libertarianism and there was a left-wing libertarianism, if you like. I had my friend John Clark, who is a writer on anarchism, and Newt Gingrich, who wrote the manifesto for the neoconservative movement in the United States, sold libertarian pamphlets at the same table at Tulane University in 1967. And one went right and one went left, and we know what happened since, But it was an extraordinary time because we knew then, we discerned some of these things philosophically, but then there was also an incredible existential moment because a window opened, a window that later closed. For us, it was a window opened by LSD, and it was a window that opened onto another world. And after it closed, I mean, 2-3 years later, even if you did that, it was closed. Other things that happened was the Rolling Stones concert at Altamont, for instance, which ended the summer or the year of love or the hippie love and turned into the amphetamine hate-filled biker days of the serial killers and Charles Manson. So you have. It was an amazing time because all of these were not quite distinct at the time. They were part of the same of the same world. Now, coming from Romania, what I loved about being in this world was the noise, was the fact, and the color, because everything, you could say anything you wanted as loud as you wanted to, and there are colors in the advertisements on the wall. There are women, gigantic women eating chocolate. And in Romania, of course, a gray country or black and white lived, and you have 9 portraits of the Communist Party commissariats, these 9 fat guys with triple chins looking down on you all the time when you waited for the bus in the cold, and it was a creepy place. And yet there were even then some signs that things are thawing, that you had the writers and we're soon going to have a certain degree of limited liberty. But coming here, it was amazing because I could speak as loud as I wanted to, and it was wonderful. Everything made noise.
Did you, now as far as that, so that was the 60s, you started writing poetry though, and just in case, you know, people don't know you, it's, you know, there's a lot of information people can read about you, but just a very, very quick glimpse into your writing life. I mean, you started writing poetry when you were very young, when you were in Romania, and you continued, and you've written many anthologies, you've written in very many different genres, you've written novels and essays, and you've published magazines as well. I think, like David, you've written for films and music, you've written libretti, haven't you, David, as well, I think. So you've both tried out lots of different writing personas as well. Does it matter if people don't know how to label you? I mean, they'd call you, when we're writing our PR, we'd say the poet, Andrei Codrescu, and the novelist, David Mitchell. But it's more than that. There's much, much more behind that. Do you need the labels? Does anybody need the labels?
I think we're a new kind of people. We don't need labels. I think we're sort of border crossers. You know, we belong simultaneously to all the cultures. I can say that I'm more of an American poet and I'm a Romanian, and I'm from Sibiu, which is a great town in Romania. And I'm also from New Orleans, where I lived for a number of years, and I'm a New Yorker. So, you know, I mean, you can put a label on those things, and I don't think there's much difference between the genres either, although obviously writing a novel is more capacious and you have a different, you know, culture behind it, but the poems belong to the same psychological and inner world, you know, so I think film and the collaborative arts are probably very different. I don't know, what is your experience in Cloud Atlas, which is an amazing movie, by the way?
So that was, David's book was Cloud Atlas, was made into a film in 2012, 13, something like that, was it?
I think around then, 13 maybe. That experience was entirely positive, Andrei, and I had nothing to do with it. The 3 directors, the Wachowskis and Tom Tykwer, the German director, are also screenwriters, so they did all of that, and I just watched from the sidelines. They invited me on set, so I actually acted more in Cloud Atlas than I wrote the script for Cloud Atlas. I'm in about 2 scenes, and if you blink, you miss me. But
I think I did see
it was. Thank you. But it was my first immersion in that world. I would agree with you about labels. I'm only interested in the work, really. Are people's books any good? Can I connect with them? Well, I say good, of course, in the most subjective sense, but I can happily immerse myself in a writer's work and not know where they're from, not know when they are from, not know who they are, except of course the who comes through. Regarding, am I a novelist or am I a librettist or screenwriter? My home is the novel. This is my home form, but it's quite a lonely country, the country of the novel. Because you have to do everything yourself, everything, all of the characters, all of the worlds, the plots. There's only one person who can contribute to make this world of the novel, and it's you. I like to work in screen just because I get to work with friends. I get to have a colleague. If you only work with colleagues, as most people do for the whole of their working life, your colleagues can drive you crazy. But if you never have a colleague, you start to miss them. And the joy of working in the joy of having a writing partner with a screen project is I can throw a half-baked idea in, and because of the chemistry, they won't throw this half-baked idea out. They will take it and look at it, and they'll bring their experiences to it, and they'll work on it, and we'll discuss it. And after half an hour, my half-baked idea is a perfectly baked idea, and I love that process.
Can I ask you something both about language? I mean, I know that Andrei collaborates quite a lot, but language is something that you are both obviously obsessed with, and you love creating language and new languages as well. And I think that one of the reasons probably is because you both speak foreign languages. I know that you speak Japanese, David, don't you? And you were in Italy. You lived in Japan, in Hiroshima, for a number of years, and your wife is Japanese, and you've translated from Japanese. And you speak Italian too, don't you? Because you lived in Italy for a while.
I would.
No. Yes.
Now my Italian is.
Okay, I won't put you on the spot with that one.
Degraded all the way back to.
So, Andrei, living in Romania, as you did, because the thing about Romania, it's surrounded by 5 countries. So you've got so many languages, and Sibiu, which is right in the center of Romania. I mean, you must have grown up speaking Hungarian, German, Romanian.
Yeah, I spoke Hungarian with friends, and then before school, and then I spoke German with my mother and the Fräulein Ilse, who took care of me when my mother was working, and I spoke Romanian when I went to school. And but I didn't think they were foreign languages. You know, I just thought that they were the way you spoke to Peter. Yeah, I spoke in Hungarian, and I spoke in German with my mother, but it didn't occur to me that they were actually different in any way, except this is how you spoke to those people. And when I went to school, my brain froze for a few years, because the grammar and things of that nature entered into the picture, and I was told that they are different. But you know, they're still there, and you know, it helped that I didn't speak a word of English when I came to the States, because I learned from the body language of people I talk to, because language, I think, is great. Of course, we're writers, that's what we work with, but I think they're a small part of learning the language, because people move their bodies when they speak, and they mean things that are not evident in the words. So when I started writing, to me, that became part of the learning of the language. And I love David's characters, who speak such amazing languages. And I was actually wondering, you know, I was going to ask you, because I didn't understand sometimes that language in the film, when that's the kind of Elvish or whatever it was that I was speaking. How did you work on that? What was the process there?
Well, it's Hawaii. So that section's set in Hawaii, and it's set in the future in Hawaii, in a dystopian post-civilizational collapse future. So I tried to collapse English and knock off the more baroque edges of English with a chisel and a hammer. I think Hawaiian is something like Romanian in that there are many languages that arrived with successive waves of immigration to Hawaii. Of course, there's a native Hawaiian language, but there was an immigration of, or there was a wave of cheap Chinese labor that who brought their linguistic influence to the mix. English, of course, that I remember a taxi driver from the airport was Portuguese. He was explaining about the Portuguese immigration. It was a place where poor Japanese farmers migrated to in the early part of the 20th century. So it's this beautiful melting pot of phrases and linguistic influences. And I guess the third ingredient, I was teaching English in Japan at the time, so I just incorporated some of the mistakes that my students made, and because of course language evolves through people kind of getting it wrong, and one generation's correct form of a language is a mutated matrix of errors from the perspective of 3 or 4 generations ago. So I tried to accelerate and meld these factors to make my Elvish.
You know, Andrei, that for me, Andrei, that's how your creation of language from your poems as well too. And you know, I've just been reading the one book of poems, No Time Like Now, which was published last year, 2019, in English. And it's almost, when I read your poems, it's like looking at a Matisse painting of cutouts. It's almost as though you're cutting out certain words, maybe not every third word. It's not as regular as that. But I wonder how you're stringing your words together. I mean, it's I don't know how your brain works, but it's absolutely beautiful.
Well, that's one of the benefits of poetry, but that you don't need to finish a sentence, and you don't need to make a connection, because the reader will, or not, or will make another one altogether. But I was thinking too that we were speaking about a language that we do have another thing in common, which is Lafcadio Hearn. I wrote the introduction, a big introduction to the translation of, well, not translation actually, Lafcadio Hearn Ghost Tales, which he wrote in Japan. They're the Japanese ghost tales. And I followed Hearn because I first ran into his work in New Orleans, because it's the only place that he still remembered. At the end of the 19th century, he was one of the most famous American writers. He was in the league of Mark Twain and Robert Louis Stevenson. And then he was forgotten, except for New Orleans, where he is remembered for his novels Cheetah and another book. And then he wrote this wonderful thing called 2 years in West Indies. He spent a year in Martinique. And I actually went to Martinique to follow Hearn. And the city of Saint Pierre doesn't exist anymore because it was blown away by a volcano. And but it's in the book, and I went and saw it through his eyes there. It's an amazing, amazing piece of work. And then he went to Japan. And he disappeared from America, but he's worshipped in Japan, from what I understand. His stories are made into plays.
He is. Yeah, he's
You know
revered
him,
as an
yes?
early. Oh yeah. There's the city of Matsue on the Sea of Japan coast in Japan, which is a spooky and atmospheric, quite Lafcadio Hearnian sort of a town. There's a medium-sized tourist industry based entirely on him, and these stories that Andrei alludes to are very widely read in Japan, and I think he's revered as one of the first Westerners who maybe in the mold of Donald Keene, who a couple of generations later in the immediate post-war era moved to Japan and threw his lot in with the Japanese and mastered the language, and ultimately even renounced his American citizenship in favor of a Japanese one. He's revered for making that for going all the way, not for being a Westerner who flew in, took the parts that he liked and left the rest and then went. And wrote a book about my great Nippon experience, but he married and supported his wife's family financially. He went the whole hog, and Japanese people appreciate people who go the whole hog. But the Irish are in on the act as well now.
Of course, he was actually born of a Greek mother and an Irish father, because his father was in the British Army, and his mother was from the island of Lefkos and hence Lafcadio, and he was raised in Ireland by his rather strict aunt, and who then, when he turned about 16, they gave him £5 and said, "Go find yourself." I
want to bring
what
it
a great way to get rid of your kids.
Yeah.
Hey,
I think a lot of
here's a
people...
£5. Well, good luck. We'll see you in a few years, if only.
Oh dear, Andrei. I think you're talking about the influence of Japan, which has obviously had a huge influence on both of you. But what about Romania itself? I mean, does Romania now have any great pull for you?
Yes.
Are you still writing in Romanian?
Yes, I started again to write in Romanian, but there is an interesting connection there, which is far, sort of far-flung. It's the influence that the readers of Japanese, Hearn, for instance, knew Fenollosa, who was Ezra Pound's teacher, really. Fenollosa and Ezra Pound had a big connection. So modernism owes quite a deal to Hearn and to Japan. Romania, of course, is where Tristan Tzara and the Dada impulse came from. And so the parallel tracks of the avant-garde and modernism meet at a certain point. And although they're different things, and for a variety of reasons, modernism became beloved of academics because they could put everything under an umbrella or a label, if you like. And the avant-garde had other purposes. They had more revolutionary purposes, ideological revolutionary purposes, but they did meet. And so in the poetry revolution in the United States, so you had Allen Ginsberg in the Beats, you had Gary Snyder, who was also a Japanese scholar who had lived in Japan, and he learned to write the wonderful calligraphy in Japanese. So, it's this melange, that gave birth.
What about the great poets, though, in Romania too? Because I mean, I've heard the phrase that every Romanian thinks they are a poet or is born a poet, or in the era that you grew up, of course, it wasn't possible to publish much avant-garde, I should imagine, or anything particularly not linked to the state, because what people still forget, I think, is how difficult it was in Romania. I mean, we're 30 years on now from the Romanian Revolution. It was the only bloody revolution in Europe of that time. It was a really difficult place to write in, to grow up in.
Well, it was clearly it was for the writers who wrote in the Stalinist era, because they were indeed forced to write in the socialist realist manner, things about the glory of the proletariat and the wonders of upcoming communism, which really was Walmart, where you could get everything you wanted, and it was cheap. But that never happened, of course. And then in the 60s, when Romania transitioned to a kind of nationalist, communist, I mean, the rhetoric was communist, and the reality was nationalist. And so under Ceausescu and his period, Romania suffered from all sorts of things, but writers suffered from the delusion that Ceausescu acquired in North Korea when he visited there and wrote, reinvented sort of Stalinist socialist realism for Romanian writers who had felt free for about 10 years. And were writing wonderful and connecting with literature and all, reading enormous. I still think Romania is the greatest place for translations. They translate everything. But then that freedom they shut down. And so I think part of the revolution when it came, it was, partly economic because people were starving, but also because the intellectuals are extremely disaffected, and the intellectuals made a big difference. In Romania, which was really fairly a new country, and the intellectuals invented it.
That's a statement. But in 1989, I know that you were actually asked by National Public Radio and ABC News in the United States to go and report on the revolution. So you were in the States and you rushed over there pretty much as soon as I think Timișoara, the revolution started in Timișoara, and you were sent over there. What do you remember about that time? I mean, that must have been a huge personal upheaval for you as well to go back then. And
I pretended to be a reporter for NPR News and ABC television, but I really went back just to hear the language and kind of take a bath in my childhood and see what it was. So it was an emotional experience, and I believed that there was a revolution, that in fact, and there was a great upheaval. And I think that, I reported it just like everybody else did at the time as a tremendous people's uprising, and with a lot of bodies. And it turned out, and this is in the book I wrote about it, that later we found other things, that a lot of things were staged and a lot of the revolution didn't happen. And people died really for no good reason, because there was nobody who was on the side of the dictator. So there wasn't the dictator's army versus the people. It was just the dictator, who was pretty pathetic at the end, that his wife were executed by their close, by their intimate circle. And so in order to create the idea of a big mass movement, which it became, I think there were, there was planning, and so you could call it, yes, a revolution. But I realized in the second visit there, which was during the Iliescu's, what was it called, Piazza Libertății, the Liberty Square in front of the university there, that which was suppressed in cold blood. I mean, really was an awful thing. I realized then that Romania was very far from having gotten rid of its oppressors.
And what impact does Romania have on you now? I mean, I noticed from your writing, of course, it has, obviously it's there, but are they scars, or are they an inspiration? I mean, it's got an incredible literary history, which I think you'd probably be proud of.
It's 1989. I just returned there, and I had some old friends, and I made new friends, and I've been reading books and regaining the language and the literature, which is indeed rich.
Indeed.
Do you dream in Romanian, Andrei?
What's that? What did you say?
Do you dream in Romanian?
Dream?
Dream, yeah.
No, somebody asked this, and I don't dream in language, I mean, things happen and I see them, and I imagine some of the settings are, but I don't hear any words. I never do.
Really?
Gosh. Yeah. Do you dream it in language, David, or in color?
Yes. In images, but also, yes, language. People speak. Last night, it was a little bit of a dark dream, but an old gentleman I know was dying in the road in my local town, and an old friend and I were sat next to him, comforting him as he left the world, and we were all speaking in English in that dream. It's just in the front of my mind. So
did you ever dream in Japanese?
Scripted.
Did you ever dream in Japanese? Did you have? I mean, what kind of impact did Japan have on you? In the way that we're describing, I think, say with Romania, these locations, these countries, these cultures, they're in our DNA. They're bound to be somehow.
there are different ways to answer your question, and I would like to choose the way I would like to choose is a way that I hope will nudge it towards Andrei as a poet as well. It influenced me because it stripped me back linguistically to being an infant. I couldn't say anything when I arrived. I didn't know how to ask for food. I didn't know how to cross the road. I knew nothing. And English really, it isn't widely spoken there now, but this was true even less in the mid 1990s. So I had to begin from zero. I had to begin from nothing. And not only did I not know what words I needed, I didn't even know the word order, because of course the sentences aren't in the same order in all languages, which once you're a linguist, you know, of course, there are some languages where the verb comes at the end and some words, languages where the verb comes after the subject, like English. But I didn't even know that. So this was an illuminating gift. I was forced to understand that there are many ways to say the same thing, and that the same thing is not exactly the same thing. And for a poor monolingual English kid, this was quite an illumination. I think for Andrei, who was born into polyglot situation, this was of course a natural thing, but it was, I'm very grateful to that experience for this. Everything I said was a guess. Everything was, I was brought back to a year zero linguistically, and so as an adult I got to learn how to assemble a new language, like knowing nothing about how a car is put together. Then all of a sudden you're working in a garage and you have to learn how to build a car from nothing. I'm not really sure if this is a question for you, Andrei,
No,
but I'm
it's
wondering if
you know what it does is
response to that.
actually we've got a couple of more minutes before we open up to questions, but I think it opens a door for me to quickly ask you both about the impact of now on our lives and on your writing as well too, because our lives have been overthrown in the same way. When I was reading about 1989 again and the Romanian Revolution, and I was reading Utopia Avenue again and the 60s and that really kind of exhilarating feeling of revolution again, I was thinking, okay, now everything is being overturned. Our whole lives are being changed, from bottom up. And I wonder whether you feel that are you writing about that time? Are you in some way dealing with it, or are you ignoring it? Are you trying to read to entertain or to inform? I mean, how are you dealing with that time now?
I always thought this was theoretically a prison planet.
A prison planner?
Yes, a planet, yes. And now it is literally a prison planet for all of us because of this virus that's here. I don't know why we've been put in prison. What did we do exactly? But it must be a metaphysical question because we don't know. But I do write about it, and I put together Romania with in the idea of exile from the place where I was born into a poem. So after David tells us about that, I mean, maybe I could read it if there is time.
That would be great. And David, what about you? Are you writing about now? Are you trying to make sense of it?
I wrote a short story that was included in the New York Times collection of short pieces about the pandemic. I'm still making sense of it now. I work more at the speed of a slightly lazy novelist and less at the speed of a journalist who needs to meet the deadlines. But it is a remarkable time, and the boundaries and nature of that remarkableness is something I'm still it's something that's unfolding now. I would agree with Andrei. It is a form of a prison, but it's also it is a hierarchical prison. There are luxury penthouse prison cells, and there are much less fortunate prison cells, and there are people who do not have the luxury of any kind of a prison cell, who of course have to go out and work and have to expose themselves to the virus, because if they don't, they will lose their ability to feed the family and they might get evicted. So it's a strange prison. It's a prison with some very privileged wings.
How do you break out eventually? I mean, who knows how long we're going to be in these luxury prisons, if you like. But it's what kind of society afterwards emerges from this afterwards too. I mean, Andrei, do you think about that? I must say, I cannot tell you how strongly it's hit me thinking about the revolutions of Europe in 1989, because I've had to do quite a lot of work about that recently, and the ideals then of building up new societies and so on. I keep thinking, what kind of society are we going to be building up after this? We've got a great opportunity, if you like, but I
think it's we have lived and written in a pre-pandemic world, and there will be another kind of art and people in the post-pandemic world, just like they were in after World War I and World War II. After World War I, the entire look and feelings of the world changed because people did not want the opulence of the empires anymore, either stylistically or oppressing in them in their lives. And World War II had a similar effect on societies. And I think we're now in the middle of World War III in the pandemic, and that this is World War III, and there will be a difference in what comes, which I can't see and I can't imagine really.
Gosh, what about you, David? I find that, I mean, the fact that you speak with such strength and insight as well, also several decades, Andrei, you can look back and see what, you've been through so much. I don't feel I could possibly can compare anything we're going through with what you've been through.
The pandemic seems to have made many opposites simultaneously true. I do think about what happens in 10 years' time, and I don't. I can have a pretty clear idea of what the world would look like at the end of the year, and I don't. I do feel sure, and I don't. I do think this is an opportunity to reset our societies and to reboot them, and I hope make them more egalitarian. Socialism, this extremely old-fashioned, out-of-date word that would be guaranteed to lose anybody elections, anybody who dared espouse it. All of a sudden we have right-wing exchequers, right-wing finance ministers rushing through legislation, emergency legislation that would have made Jeremy Corbyn in the UK or left-wing figures blush. It's quite unimaginable 18 months ago that a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer would subsidise the nation's pay slips from the Treasury. This is a genie that I think will not very easily go back into the lamp.
And one of the things I remember you speaking about quite a lot before the pandemic was your concern for the environment and against climate change and so on too. And I wonder whether issues like that have now become submerged or part of the bigger story. I mean, there's so much has happened in the last few months. It's almost impossible to take. And New York, of course, was the center of the lockdown. You had a massive lockdown in New York, and then you've had Black Lives Matter. Enormous upheaval. There's a lot to take in at the moment, a lot to digest, I think.
Yeah, it's as if we've had about a quarter of a century's worth of social and political change in about 7 months.
I know.
and the cards are being reshuffled at an extraordinary speed, and some cards are flying out of the pack and spiraling and coming into the pack at a completely different place. There's opportunity. It's not all bleak. It is bleak if you're losing your job and you can't pay the mortgage, and I'm not making light of that. But I think there are some things that required systemic change that only a pandemic could possibly begin to change. And I hope that these two get connected in the upcoming years. The things that only a pandemic could have shifted, I hope that these shifts are usefully applied to the post-pandemic world. There's the saying in English, I'm not sure who coined the aphorism, but never let a good crisis go to waste. This is a mother of crises, and as the mother of crises, it can affect quite gargantuan changes in areas like climate change and the way that capitalism is destroying the planet's ability to support us. There's hope that the pandemic could affect changes that nothing else could. I'm now repeating myself, so back to you.
Andrei,
I was just going to say that one of my favorite things David said somewhere was that time was what stopped things from happening at once. And I think we are witnessing an extraordinary speeding of time in that way. And the technology has a lot to do with it, and so do other things. What takes place in a day now used to take a year or more.
Well, we've certainly created something
is
new
happening all at once now
with this new technology now. I mean, look at how we are now. I mean, you were talking about language being physical. You know, we cannot enjoy that at the moment. We can't enjoy the physicality of being together. We're trying to be extra creative virtually on Zoom, I suppose. But David.
We can't meet physically, it's true, and we exist in these little rectangles on screens. And yet, I've met more new people in the last 6 months than I've ever met in the days when we could just jump on planes and fly. I've had a richer diversity of conversations, including meeting Andrei here, than I've ever had in any 6-month period in my life. This wouldn't have happened without the pandemic. We've met each other more often in the last 6 months than we normally meet each other.
It's true. It's absolutely true.
So here's another contradiction.
And there you are. You're in Romania for the first time. Let's end this hour together with some actual writing, some reading. May I invite you both to send us out beautifully. So, Andrei,
I would like to be a little bit dictatorial. Would we be able to let Andrei have the last word, because I'd like him to. And I've just got a short section you asked me to read about Andrei's old friend Allen Ginsberg. This isn't really about him. He appears as a character, and I've never read this section before. So, is it okay if I'm dictatorial like this?
Yes.
Okay. I think a poet deserves the last word, so that's good. I must thank you for indulging me.
No, absolutely. I do like it when you take control. There you are. We have. Go ahead.
It's 1968, 1967, and we're in a house in South Kensington, the house where Syd Barrett lives from Pink Floyd, and my protagonist here, Elf, is a 22-year-old young musician who is looking for her boyfriend in this party. She walks up the stairs and knocks on the door, and knock, knock. Aha, the door was opened by Whatsit. I'm sorry for the cloak and dagger. He rebolted the door behind them, but if word got out, the hoi polloi would be kicking my door down. Whatsit's room was lit by a paper lamp on a tripod, its beam revolved like a lighthouse's, traversing yellow walls,
floorboards painted purple and yellow, and a boarded-up fireplace. Black tulips stood in a black vase. The window showed a South Kensington nocturne of chimney pots, TV aerials and gutters. 6 people sat or lay on beanbags, a low bed and cushions. Vanessa from earlier said, "Oh, we thought we'd lost you. Do you know Sid?" Sid Barrett, the leader with Pink Floyd, was strumming a guitar and singing, "Have you got it yet? Have you got it yet? Have you got it yet?" over and over. He didn't appear to notice Elf. A man with an imperial beard, a rose print shirt and a shiny pate introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Al Ginsberg. Great to meet you. Elf, Bill Graham's gonna love this." He held up Fletcher and Holloway's Shepherd's Crook EP. "Allen Ginsberg, the poet?" Elf checks with Bruce. "The Allen Ginsberg?" Bruce has a "what did I tell you" face. "Oh, don't believe everything you read about me," said Allen Ginsberg. "Just most of it. My friend Bill happens to own the Fillmore Theatre. You've heard of the Fillmore, right?" "But of course. It's the venue in San Francisco, bar none." "And you'd fit right in there," says Ginsberg. "You're folkier than a lot of the acts, but you're not just folky." "Oh, would be over like a shot," said Bruce, "if Mr. Graham could sort out the flight for us. Right, Elf?" Elf was too stunned to do much, but nod. "Definitely." I'll keep it short and sweet and end there.
Bravo.
Yeah, Alan was everywhere in those days.
So I hear.
Well, I'm glad we found something that you had in common as well too. Many before we ask you to finish, Andrei, we've had a question from the director of the Romanian Cultural Institute in London. She wants to know whether there is any kind of, whether you could both see some kind of common experience, whether you could actually even collaborate on something. Would there be anything you've seen in the last hour, heard from each other that might be, that sparked something?
Well, I was going to ask David, but I was going to do it privately, so I might as well do it this way. I wrote a novel called Messiah, which is a sort of of fiction, fantastic fiction book that was made into a terrible film by Julie Delpy, the French actress, actually. Nobody ever saw it, thank goodness. But I would like to reboot it because I think it's timely. So I was going to ask him if it was okay to send it. David, if I send you the book, will you read
Most
it?
certainly.
Okay.
Oh,
Good.
most certainly. If it's still available, then I'll order it from my local independent bookstore in my little Irish town here.
It might.
So,
yeah, sure. Great.
yeah, I'll investigate, and Rosie can give us the our emails.
That sounds like a good collaboration.
Yes,
I look forward to the film, obviously coming out at some point. I mean, and we've got another question as well too. And obviously people don't want this event to end, but the question is that from the current situation, do either of you think that you'll create some new work, some new writing from what's going on now?
A couple of friends and I are working on a screenplay set in a recently post-pandemic world. So one of my friends is quite well connected, so that has a chance of happening. Of course, with films, you never know. But there's that, and yes, I think, especially on the subject of collaboration, another unforeseen side effect of the lockdown is that many people who have been intending to work with each other for years, but never have, because periods when both or all parties are free have never coincided, suddenly have no excuse. Suddenly we're all free. Suddenly I'm not on book tour. Suddenly my filmmaking friends are not making films. Suddenly my actor friends are, in many cases, out of work. So actually, I think in the next 5 years, we will see a lot of strange cross-germination is happening now. And I think we will see artistic projects, films and collaborations, and maybe new art forms that haven't quite got names yet. We will see them beginning to flourish, and their roots will come back to this bizarre half year that we've had. So I would confidently say yes, both myself, but I think more generally as well.
Andrei, how about you?
Oh, I agree completely that we'll see. I mean, it's hard to see what the post-pandemic world will be like, but I agree that if we make it through the environmental crisis and we're still on the planet, it will be a different place. And it will be a collaborative one because we did indeed learn how to talk to other people and through this means of communication. And I saw a horror film made on Zoom where everybody was screaming. It was terrific. But it's, I don't know. I'm not, I can't tell. No one can tell the future, really. I mean, it takes a lot of guts to do a post-pandemic story, film, because it's hard to say.
And it's interesting you're both talking about film too. Yeah. Andrew, how about on a poem? Because we would both, David and I both love you to end the event with one of your poems.
Yeah, this brings together a few places. If David's prose was from in 1968, this is March 13, 2020, in the COVID age, and I was living in Queens, New York, and it's called Sirens in Queens. There is a hospital around the corner, and the sirens are nonstop. Sirens in Queens. And as you know, of course, that Ovid Ovidius was the first poet exiled to Romania. And he's also our first poet, and he's the world's first exile as a poet. So Romania has ever since exiled its poets in a sort of reciprocal act of poetry. So this is called Sirens in Queens, and it's March 13. In exile in Tomis, Ovid wrote letters to Augustus about the painted natives and the brutal winters. There were physicians in the Lyceum in Tomis, a Greek seaport of vivid spectacles and goods. Augustus received Ovid's Triste and ignored the poet's exaggerated plaints and sorrows and enjoyed his gloomy verse of the province. Rome was much safer without the amorous lech. Exiled in the Ozarks, I aroused pity in New York, the city as its inhabitants called it for its splendors. In the Ozarks, survivalists juggled snakes in caves. I had 2 caves, saw snakes. There was no doctor near. In Siberia, Pasternak, the doctor, was kidnapped by armies to tend to their wounded and their goals that were as hard and cold as their winters, and out he trudged in the movie through the snow. Some plagues are real, some were not. In retrospect, many people died in history's show. For historians, heirs, poets, and filmmakers, there is no better subject than great distance, social or forced or voluntary or just geographical. People willing and unwilling to grow the space between others, even lovers, kin, or parts of their own selves. Distance is the only subject to sing and emote for. Under house arrest in Bucharest, there was a policeman watching at your door. If you got sick and needed to get to the hospital fast, you just called your guardian and got there in a jiff. Now you call an ambulance, and by the time they get there, you'll be stiff.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to have brought you together. We had no idea what would happen, but look, it was magic. Thank you very, very much indeed to Andrei Codrescu and David Mitchell. David, you will have to go to Romania now.
Rosie.
You must go to Romania now.
Yeah.
And next time we're in Brooklyn, yes. I'm afraid we're going to come and break into that prison cell, Andrei. So thank you everyone for watching, and do buy their books. All details of all the books are on our websites, and you can send in your comments as well on social media. And make sure you listen to the rest of the festival. We've got 4 weeks of great conversations with people like David and many Romanian writers, many British writers coming together. We've got seminars, we've got workshops, we've got panels. You won't be able to avoid hearing about Romania rocks. So thank you both to David Mitchell and to Andrei Codrescu, and thank you from me, Rosie Goldsmith. Take care.
Thanks much.
Thank you very much.
you.